Yeah, for those of you unaware or unfamiliar with Dr. McDonald, I guess now is a good time to give a little background while we figure this out. So we all here like to welcome Dr. McDonald, and we thank him graciously for doing this AMA and for the opportunity to talk to him. And Dr. Kevin McDonald has experience as a professor of psychology at the California State University of Long Beach. He's also infamously known or famously known to all of us here as the author of The Culture of Critique, which we've been reading, as well as other books like Understanding Jewish Influence, a study in ethnic division, which and his contributions and his intellectual honesty as well as bravery is, I think, something which should inspire us all. Um, and we're very, as I've said, we're very glad to have him here.
Also, as we go through the questions, I don't know, we'll see how we open it up. So we'll open it up per person, then mute them and bring the next person in, or because I do kind of, I don't know, there's just so many people. I guess we just do it one by one because there's so many. We can't have just discourse amongst each other, you know?
Yeah, it's, you know, so as the one person's asking the question, the next person will unmute them, and then, you know.
Yeah, we'll see.
One by one.
But it would be nice, you know, if he gives an answer, just to ask us like a follow-up question, not a different question, but just, you know, a small follow-up question. Do you think that would be possible?
Yes, I don't see why that wouldn't be possible. Again, I'll reiterate for those of you who have just joined, leave your questions in the questions text channel, and we'll get to them kind of by a first come, first served basis, so long as they're acceptable questions, which would include the fact that they aren't copycat questions.
Zach, will we be posing the questions for them, or will we unmute
No,
them?
we'll unmute them is how we'll do that.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay, looks like excellent. Yeah.
Yes, you are. Yep.
Let's just try that again. See how is it sounding? Maybe if you have to turn it up or down.
Give us a test 1, 2, 3.
Says voice connected.
Excellent.
Yep.
All right,
Yeah,
yeah,
very
that's
fine.
good.
That's
That's
fine.
good.
Do you hear it now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
perfect.
Yeah, we hear it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Zach. I guess you start with the first question. And again, thank you, Dr. MacDonald, for coming and giving us your time.
So the first
Yeah, glad to be
question,
here.
comes from Grant, and I'll let him ask that question.
Okay. Hi, Dr. McDonald. Do you believe that Jewish IQ is declining through the generations? So, in other words, do 25-year-old Jews have a lower IQ than like 60-year-old Jews?
You mean as people get older, that their IQ gets lower?
No, just that there's been sort of degradation, sort of intellectual ability, just as the Jews were super dominant in like the 60s and 70s in sort of like the academic and maybe even more so in like the intellectual competitions and stuff. But today, you see in the academic competitions, there are more Asians, there are other market dominant minorities in comparison to just Jewish dominance.
Yeah, that's Ron Unz wrote a very interesting paper on Jewish enrollment in Ivy League universities and so on. And one of the points he made was that Jews are no longer getting prizes like Phi Beta Kappas. They're not getting the awards. They're not. And he sort of gave the impression that Jews are complacent now, and that a lot of them are very wealthy, and they feel entitled, and they don't really have a lot of drive. Whereas 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, very intense drive to succeed. And that's maybe dissipating. It's quite possible. Yeah.
And so, do you think that's more to do with the drive, or just the IQ? Do you think the IQ is also slowly going down?
Well, IQ is pretty genetically determined, and I think there are environmental influences. I would attribute more to the drive, certainly. It's hard to see exactly how IQ would go down, because IQ would have to go down via some kind of, some kind of negative assortative mating, where you're not, marrying people of comparable intelligence or something like that. IQ doesn't just go down, because of this. Well, there's certainly some environmental influences on IQ that may have changed. I mean, but again, I would think, just looking at Ron Enz's work, he attributed much more to drive. And I guess I'd agree with that. I think it's probably much more drive. It's hard to see how a trait as heritable as IQ is would decline that rapidly, in the last generation or so.
And
Okay, so the next question will be from Red Spicer, and so I'll let him ask that question.
Richard Spicer, go ahead.
Oh, okay. What is a good way to introduce a person or family member who is not aware about the JQ, the Jewish question?
It's really hard. It's not something that is easily conveyed to people. It's not like you can give them little sound bites. It's not like you can focus on one or two things, like with race realism and blacks. You talk about IQ, you talk about criminality, and that kind of thing. But with Jews, it takes some reading and some work, I think, and it's complex. I mean, for example, when you talk about Jews in the media, people, their eyes sort of glaze over. So you have to bring out statistics. You have to look at who owns the media, who's contributing to the media, and so on, and what happens to people when they dissent from some position that Jews typically uphold, say related to race or diversity or immigration, something like that. There are a lot of examples in Hollywood, say, of blacklisting people who are, actors who are conservative and who take positions that are not approved really by the mainstream Jewish community. So it takes some effort, I think, and you have to do some reading. I mean, I've written some books and stuff like that, and most people are never going to read those books. But I think that if you read websites like Occidental Observer, we do a lot of Jewish things, and they're accessible, I think, and they deal with specific topics in the history of Judaism, Jews in the media, Jews in the academic world, Jews in immigration policy and refugee policy, and so on. And it's subtle because you can't ever say all Jews are X. It's not ever like that. But what you have to focus on is, what is the mainstream, the big Jewish organizations? I mean, because quite often they are on page with certain issues related, say, to Israel, related to immigration and refugee policy, related, in other areas like that. So it's not something that can easily be done, but I think that those data are accessible, though, and people can get into it. I think more and more people are.
Okay, I think that's pretty good. I'd
Yeah,
like
that's
to
good.
ask a question. So I've gone to 2 different Cal States, and both departments were very like homogenous within their ethnicity. Like one was all Armenian, and one was all Chinese in the other one. I was wondering if you saw similar habits in general at Long Beach, like departments having a chair who brings in his own.
That's interesting. Certainly in the departments of ethnic studies, that would happen, and has happened, of course. But in other departments, I never noticed that particularly. I've noticed. At Long Beach, we had departments of Jewish studies and Chicano studies, Black studies, Asian studies, and so on. But in other areas, I'd say Jews are pretty distributed, and I don't notice a big ethnic push. I think that has happened in the past, but I only have anecdotal data on that. I've never really researched it.
And then real quick, were you ever guided by your chair to teach a certain way, or were you allowed to teach the way you wanted to?
Well, I was basically allowed to teach the way I wanted to, as long as I kept to the syllabus and to the course as advertised. I taught developmental psychology, so child development, that sort of thing. I taught evolutionary psychology. And if I would have gone into my child development courses and talked about anti-Semitism, I think that would have been inappropriate. They would have fired me. But it is the case that they did not have me teach evolutionary psychology after things got heated around 2006. And I think that was because in the area of evolutionary psychology, I could have talked about Jewish intellectual movements, and I could have talked about a lot of things that they would not want me to talk about. I was also, sort of pressured not to talk about race and IQ in certain ways. But that was a topic in my child development textbook, so it was certainly something I would talk about.
Okay, and the next question will come from InfoCat. I believe it has 2 questions, so we'll let him ask that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, my first question is concerning the debate that we have in the alt-right over the level of consciousness in Jewish ethnic activism in the West. I've heard several YouTube videos, or I've listened to several YouTube videos where you stated the idea that the vast majority...
I'm having a hard time understanding you. Could you
speak a little slower?
Okay, I've listened to quite a lot of YouTube videos where you had spoken in conferences and brought up the idea that the vast majority of Jewish ethnic activists are not doing it on a conscious basis. They are ethnocentric, but still believe in egalitarianism to a large extent. Their ethnocentrism is a byproduct, essentially, of their particular psychology, but they are not very conscious of it. Are you still of this belief? Do you still hold it?
That's interesting. I haven't talked about that very much, I don't think. But I would say there's a lot of unconscious aspects to Jewish ethnocentrism. I think that it's very difficult to talk with Jews, say, about anti-Semitism. I think there's almost a blind spot there. And I don't think they're really aware of how sort of other observers would see how they analyze these things. I mean, we have a lot of examples on Occidental Observer, Occidental Quarterly, of Jewish writers, academics, and so on. Just, you know, they accept just horrible arguments and ridiculous arguments, and they're smart people, and I think they believe them. And so I think there is a sort of lack of self-understanding there to a great extent. I really do. And the other thing is self-deception. You know, I have a chapter on self-deception in my book, Separation is Discontents, and it's a touchy topic because, you know, in that chapter, I sort of accepted the idea that some of these people really are sort of fooling themselves. They make these pronouncements, and they're so obviously wrong and sort of self-serving, but they don't really see that. And the problem is that with Jews, you often have these sort of self-reinforcing groups. You know, they're all on the same page, they're all the same ethnicity, and they sort of, you know, start agreeing with each other, and it becomes a sort of little echo chamber. And so I think they have a hard time getting out of that. And true of all Jewish groups, they have very strong boundaries of how far you can go. And it certainly has happened that Jews get sort of expelled from the community because they contravene something, like say in Israel, you can be a sort of renegade Jew like Gilad Atzmon, and then you get ostracized, and people won't talk to you, and all the same things that happened to me. But Jewish ethnocentrism is very intense. I think some of them are aware of it, but when you look at the real extreme ethnocentric Jews, the ones that the settlers on the West Bank and so on, they're in another universe, and you can't talk to them. They're not. They don't think in a rational way, and it's not possible to get to them. So I don't think their ethnocentrism is something that they examine or think about or question. It's just there, and it's really an intense drive, and I don't think they're very conscious of it.
Over the last couple of months, I've watched quite a lot of online videos from conventions and speeches that were held in the media specifically. For example, recently I watched together with a couple other friends the recent Atlantic meeting in a synagogue. All the major speakers were Jewish. All the journalists that were invited were Jewish. As is usually the case. I've seen other presentations of a similar form, meetings from the ADL, for example, or other lobbying groups. They are highly organized. It seems very unlikely for me that they are not conscious of their level of ethnocentrism and organization. They clearly meet with one another in public forums that are organized by highly ethnocentric organizations that are funded by major Jewish donors, billionaires sometimes, multimillionaires. The vast majority of the funding comes essentially from their own ethnic in-group.
What is the question,
all major workers, all participants in these forums are, the vast majority of them are Jewish themselves, selected from the media and from these ethnocentric lobbying organizations. It's hard for me to believe even remotely these people are not conscious of what they are doing. It looks like clearly defined ethnic activism to me.
Yeah, I see that. I was talking more about these West Bank settlers, Orthodox types. I do think that the major Jewish organizations, I think that they are aware of what they're doing. And as you say, you go to meetings and then they're all Jewish, and it becomes an echo chamber. And I think there is a long tradition within Judaism really to sort of not listen to opinions of non-Jews. I mean, it's just sort of they get into their own little world. Yeah, and I think there is. I'm not I'm not going to take a strong stand on this. I think there is a strong element of conscious ethnocentric effort. I mean, for example, just with intermarriage, and there's just a lot of concern. It's very explicit about intermarriage being a problem, and then there's explicit concern about Israel. Explicit concern about other sort of internal Jewish issues. So yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly an element of conscious ethnocentrism. I'd agree with that.
Okay, so the next question comes from River Run. Let me find him so I can unmute him. All right. Okay, he did let me know he's having some technical difficulties, so if you can't hear him,
Can I
I'll
be
ask this
heard?
question. Yeah, you can be heard.
Okay. I appreciate this AMA, Professor.
Thanks.
Okay. Let me see. I've got it here. You've spoken of the Jewish model as a possible hope for Europeans. What would you consider the Jewish model to look like, both in the realm of politics, education, and civil society? And would this entail an endorsement of the well-known rude and hostile situation in Israeli civil society, or something else?
Well, just the first part of that question. Basically, just this relates to the last question. We have to become more explicitly ethnocentric, and we have to have an explicit sense of white identity. And that has huge educational implications. We should teach our children to identify as European, as being an ethnic people, as having interests in controlling territories and so on. That has to be explicit. And Jewish organizations that have been very, very good. I mean, you look at Jewish education. Jews are ethnocentric, and a lot of it is being immersed in this Jewish world of Jewish education and Jewish going to synagogues and just socializing with other Jews. And that's the kind of thing that we don't have that tendency. I mean, Westerners tend to be really individualistic. And we are the only people in the world that are really prone, I think, genetically, towards individualism. It's very hard for us to do this, and it cuts against the grain in some ways. But I'm really afraid that individualism is not going to work out for us in the long run, in the present modern context, where you have massive immigration and you have identity politics with every other group. But every other group that we deal with, they have strong sense of them. I mean, look at blacks; they're organized as blacks explicitly, and same with Latinos and so on. So we have to be that way, and that's taking the Jewish model really, and it has vast implications for education, for how where we favor each other. In relationships and businesses and so on. So there's a long history of Jewish ethnic networking. This is something they are really good at. And we should try to be the same. We always try to be objective and get the best person and all that. Well, Jews, don't think that way. They want to get someone who's competent, certainly, but they want somebody who's Jewish quite often. And that's the way we have to start thinking. I really do. What was the last part of your question?
Sorry, let me unmute him.
I got him.
There we go.
Go ahead, River.
All right. It was about whether or not it means you endorse the the well-known rude and hostile situation in Israeli civil society. But I ultimately suppose theoretically that the question is really whether it means that you endorse Jewish moral particularism, or if you only mean for us to seem to endorse Jewish moral particularism.
Well, it's very hard to say this because moral particularism is a problem. If you look at Jewish ethics, there's a a strong tendency for having very different standards for Jews and non-Jews when it comes to crimes or slavery or anything. And for us to say that this goes against the entire Western tradition, really, going way back, probably to the origins of Christianity, but even before that, a sense of fairness and sort of universal. You look at Roman, the justice system in Roman times. It was based on sort of universal applicable laws and so on. That's just not the case with Judaism, and unfortunately, we're in a situation now where we have millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people invading Western societies, and we still cling to these Western values, and I really am concerned that they are ultimately suicidal in this current context. So we have to be more particularistic. It's true that Israeli civil society is highly aggressive, in your face, hostile. From what I understand, I talked about that in one of my articles. I think that's a different thing. I think that Jewish interpersonal aggressiveness is it's another aspect, another trait of Jews. But I'm not advocating that necessarily. But certainly that aggressiveness has been a good thing for Jews in a way that they're very aggressive. You think about the fact that Jews engineered this immigration policy beginning the 1965 immigration law. That's an incredibly aggressive act against the native population. And so they've always acted very aggressively. You think about the Israel lobby. You're talking about wars, thousands of American lives, trillions of dollars have been spent on behalf, really, of Israel. And that's extremely aggressive. So that aggressiveness is something that we have to at least deal with. But again, I think the main thing is for us to become explicitly have a sense of white identity and white interest. That's what has to happen if we're going to survive in, say, another 100, 200 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'll be posing the next question, Mr. MacDonald. So my question is that there appears to be a dramatic increase in personality disorder cases. What seems especially alarming is the increase within the type B cluster. This increase seems to especially affect people of age groups 30 and under, and within those groups, percentages can climb up in the 70s of cases being female patients. What is your take on this?
You're talking about personality disorder?
Yeah, especially in the type B cluster.
Type A as opposed to type B?
No, that the increase seems dramatic, especially within cluster B, the borderline narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial disorders.
I don't know. I mean, I have a whole theory about antisocial personality disorders, and that it really is. It's partly genetic, certainly, but it can be influenced by what we call affection. Parent-child affection is an important environmental variable for that system. And I actually hadn't read about increases in any social personality disorder. If there are strong secular changes in that, it would pretty much have to be due to environmental influences, and then they would likely involve parent-child relationships first and foremost. But I really haven't researched that aspect.
Okay, no problem. That'll do. Thank you very much. Next question, please.
Okay, let us see. Okay, so the next question is regarding evangelicals. Essentially, the question goes, what are we to do about the fact that many evangelical Christians are nearly Zionists, if not entirely Zionists? This seems to be an extremely odd phenomena among ethnically European people.
Yeah, It is a very odd phenomenon in a way. I mean, there are one aspect of this is the Schofield Bible. You have Bibles that were sort of written from a Zionist perspective, and they were encouraged and funded and so on by Jews, and the footnotes and the terminology. I mean, it is a message in the Bible. The return to power in Jerusalem, and to reestablish Israel is a big message in the Bible. It's a drumbeat. And so I can see that if you are a very seriously religious person, you might say, well, that's in the Bible. And it is to a certain extent. But I think these people are being duped by Jews who have nothing but contempt for them. And they have actually quite a few of those organizations, these evangelical organizations that are strongly Zionist, have been organized by Jews. Or else they've been strongly encouraged by Jews. We have a few articles on that in Occidental Observer. So it's not something that has occurred in a vacuum, but it has to do with these intense religious beliefs, and combined with there's an element of truth that the Bible is a Zionist document. Because it talks about return, but that was, certainly, strengthened by the Schofield Bible, and that was, funded by Felix Untermeyer. They got it published by Oxford University Press and so on. So Felix Untermeyer was a Zionist activist. So this is not something that just came out of the blue. It's been strongly, encouraged by Jews from the beginning, and some of these, again, some of the present organizations that are the Christian Zionist organizations are actually organized by Jews and funded by Jews.
That's very interesting. The next question comes from Bernard. So go ahead.
Hello, I would like to thank you for doing this question and answer session. What is the consensus regarding Jews, and more specifically, like the type of Jew I'm referring to are the Ashkenazis having like a greater Neanderthal admixture compared to other groups, and because of this having like an increase in abnormal psychology because of this Neanderthal admixture? Thank you.
I'm sorry that it's just, I've seen a little bit of that, but I just haven't delved into it. I can't help you on that one. Sorry.
Okay.
Let's get Stalker. Unmute him. Or is he unmuted? It seems he's not in.
Doesn't he have a dot
he is
before his
now,
name?
he's now unmuted. There you
Okay, go ahead, Stalker.
Okay.
I would say, though, just related to that it seems to me in general, Jewish psychology is part of the sort of Middle Eastern complex. That they are very much a Middle Eastern people. And you look at, today, Middle Eastern peoples are very clannish, very ethnocentric, very in-group oriented, in-group, out-group sorts of things. And I think that is the basic Jewish psychology is basically Middle Eastern, what they call segmentary societies, where if you look at the Middle East, from afar, it looks sort of like, well, they're all Muslim or something. But you get close and you realize it's all these different clans, and they're all, competing with each other, separate from each other. And that's Middle Eastern society. They don't have a sort of sense of universal harmony among groups or anything. It's all very segmented, and that's always been that way. And certainly, it always struck me as amazing that in the Old Testament, it says something like, when they came from Egypt and conquered the land, they enslaved these people. They retained that status in Israelite society for like 1,000 years or something like that. I mean, longer than that. In other words, those group barriers remain in those societies. There's strong sense of in-group and out-group. And that's really, I think, the fundamental of Jewish psychology. Now, whether it's some Neanderthal mixture in them, unlike other people's, I just really don't know.
Okay, so the next question comes from Stalker, but he asked me to ask it for him. The question is, what do you think about the Jewish influence upon the British Empire?
We've had a number of articles on that. Andrew Joyce has written about that. He's a historian of Jewish studies, and there certainly was a Jewish influence. Some of the wars in South Africa, for example, strong Jewish influence there. And Disraeli was very much of a British Empire kind of guy. But I can't. That's the kind of question I think Andrew Joyce would be really good at answering in a general sort of way. But we have a few articles on that, but there's a lot of writing on the Sassoon family and their influence in the opium trade in China and so on, and the Chinese British wars back in the 19th century. So there is a history to that for sure. I don't know a lot about it.
Okay. And so another question also from a user who isn't able to use their microphone is what do you think about the Jewish influence in libertarianism? Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, Ayn Rand, and Milton Friedman were all Jewish.
Yeah, that is a topic that has come up. I have not written about it, but it is certainly something that I keep getting people to ask me to write about it because it is there. And Ayn Rand, as you say, was Jewish, and like all her subordinates and so on were Jewish. It was very much a Jewish movement, from my understanding. And you mentioned other libertarians. It's interesting in chapter. In cultural critique, I did a chapter on the Frankfurt School, and it became apparent to me that what they were really pushing there was a sort of radical individualism for non-Jews. In other words, any kind of group identity for white Europeans, any kind of ethnic identity, any kind of even religious identity, they abhorred that. They wanted the free individual that's cut off from family, cut off from any kind of sense of ethnic, racial group identity, whatever. And so I think there is a strong element in Jewish thinking, especially after World War II, that the sort of solution for Jewish problems is to make Europeans individualists and to make them more individuals than they already are. And that it has been influential, I think. I mean, the whole point of authoritarian personality in chapter 5 of cultural critique is that any kind of ethnic identification of someone who's European is a pathology. It's a psychiatric issue, and there's something wrong with these people. They had horrible parent-child relationships, and they are repressed in their sexuality or something. So that's really what a strong is sort of bent, or for individualism within these Jewish intellectual movements. But of course, they don't apply that to themselves. I mean, one of the points I made in chapter 5 is they never mentioned that about Judaism, that they would, should give up their identifications and their families and all that kind of stuff the way they were advocating for non-Jews. So it was really there certainly is a strong element of that in Jewish thinking. But it again, when you look at these groups, they're strongly ethnically networked. So they're at the same time when they're preaching individualism to non-Jews, they're being highly collectivist and non-individualist within their own groups.
Okay, the next question comes from Belial, so I'll let him ask that.
Hi, Professor. I just wanted to ask, it's a sort of a two-in-one question. But first, I want to ask, what do you think the prospects are of Europe and Europeans surviving the problems that the Jewish people are causing towards them and the entire white race? And secondly, do you think there's a prospect of that happening without resorting to the same sort of Jewish tactics that Israel and the entire Jewish people have been resorting to? So what I mean by that is general subversion, using the Holocaust as sort of victimizing their entire race and sort of guilt-tripping all other races into giving them special favors. Do you think that Europeans can do without that and still survive?
Boy, I don't know. I do think Europe is in dire straits, especially Germany, Sweden, France, and the UK. They are just really in dire straits because you have a political class that's completely out of touch, even with popular attitudes. But what's amazing, these people keep voting them in. And I think that the psychology of these people in Europe is, you know, especially in Northern Europe, and that's a big part of my research now, is trying to understand Northern Europe, because it's Northwestern Europe that is really opening the gates here. And Sweden is a prime example. And I think there's a strong sense of individualism in Sweden. And they have a very hard time, coalescing against an outgroup. And but I really worry about them, because unless they do something very drastic very soon, these people are simply going to out-reproduce them. And you're going to have societies that are unrecognizable. They're not going to be European anymore. I don't think that these newcomers, though, are going to feel this guilt about the Holocaust or anything. I think that guilt is something that that especially Northwestern Europeans excel in. There's a strong tendency towards, feeling guilty. What Northern Europeans do is they tend to construct these moral in-groups where, if you're a part of the group, you're a good person. Whereas in the Middle East, if you're part of the group, you're one of our kin. Their groups are based on kinship. In Northwest Europe, groups are based much more on a sense of, I'm part of this group, I'm a good person. And so anybody who criticizes immigration or thinks Islam is barbaric or anti-female or something, those people are outside the moral universe, and they get ostracized, and they feel guilty. And so there's just a strong sense there. So I worry about Europe, but of course the entire Western world is at risk, and it's very heartening though to see Eastern Europe, doing something against that and standing up. Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on are standing up, and I'm hoping that they of course there's a huge pressure on them every time they do something. The EU takes them to court and does this and that, but I haven't lost hope. But unless something changes, we are in dire straits. I mean, if you look at the population explosion in Africa, if we keep just taking every African off the Mediterranean Sea and let them come to Europe as a refugee, forget about it. Europe, they're going to, population of Africa is rapidly increasing. They're way overpopulated already, and they're projected to increase to 4 billion by the end of the century, and that's just, that would inundate the rest of the world, black people, unless you have the political will to stop it.
Okay, so the next question is it has to do with your response to Riverrun's question regarding Jewish particularism, and it comes from NIF, so I'll let him ask that.
Hey, how are you, Professor? It's a pleasure to speak with you. I don't want this to sound like a statement, so please excuse me for that. It requires a short statement and then the question.
Sure.
Which is that if you look at Western civilization, and I'm a big fan of your books, it is correct that there is a universalism in the standards of morality and the standards of behavior, etc. And there seems to be also a clear line of descent from which Christendom begins to become more relativistic. And as it keeps going down in relativism, our society keeps collapsing and collapsing. And usually when I hear the argument that universalism is a problem, my question is, doesn't it seem to be the other way around? Basically, that the universal weight of universal objective standards of morality, when they were applied to others who could not conform to these standards, could not then conform to European standards of righteousness and good character, But the moment that we began to accept the idea that there is such a thing as subjective standards and particular standards of morality, our people then begin to, although apply those standards to ourselves, not apply them to others, and therefore excuse their misbehavior. As a traditional Catholic, to me, this is a big deal, because the moment the relativism came along, I see a collapse of Western civilization. And I see a lot of people in our movement, because I'm part of the white nationalist movement for 25 years. It seems to me that we have our people arguing for particularism when it seems to be the other way around. Am I wrong in this, or any thoughts on this? I would deeply appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I think of relativism, I don't think of Western, universalism. I think of, because that, really relativism is part of the sort of these movements that we talk about with the Jewish intellectual movements, like Franz Boas, the cultural relativism and moral relativism and so on. The idea of, say, justice, that everybody should get the same kind of treatment by the law. That's what I'm talking about. Things like everybody should be judged as an individual, that sort of thing. Those are Western inventions, really, the Enlightenment, but really going way back. And Western individualism and a sense of moral universalism can easily be traced back, really, at least to the Roman Empire, and especially after Christianity came around. So I think that's really what I'm talking about. And I agree that I think relativism is a disaster. Moral relativism is a disaster. But it's not, I think what I'm talking about was, moral universalism versus moral particularism. If we have a sense of our own group and privilege that, and a sense of interest and privilege those people, we are departing from that Western tradition. And I'm saying that may be necessary for us to do that to survive. Sad to say, it's not something that I would have wanted. But I think what has happened is that these movements, these perturbations that have been, set in motion by the left, and certainly Jews have been the backbone of the left in America and throughout the West. They are producing tensions and conflicts that are just going to produce cataclysm. And unless we adopt a sense of our own interests, we are going to be swamped. I mean, we just can't survive. In the long run. So we have to develop a sense of moral particularism, but not moral relativism. I would not want to advocate that at all.
Yeah, I think related to this, Julie has a similar question. I think you were going on to it, but I'll let Julie go on.
You're asking if we can develop our own culture now? I don't. Oh, I see. I would hope that we could, and I would hope that one possibility would Jews would finally realize that their interests are best served with a strong European Western entity in the world. That has not happened yet. I would hope that they would simply stop doing what they're doing, advocating massive immigration and all that, and really creating the culture of the left and maintaining and sustaining it. But can it be done without force? I mean, we are trying to do that. We're developing our sort of alternative intellectual universe. We have our own publications, websites, journals, and so on. And with social media now, I think we're much more connected and on page than before. And I think the alt-right is surging, because fundamentally, we are the only ones that really reject this proposition nation thing, that we are nothing except, the sort of the idea of rights and freedom, that's what we're all about in America, and anybody can come here and they'll be just like, they'll just be wonderful Americans and so on. We don't accept that. And we really have the idea that we are an ethnic group, we're a race, and we have interests in rights, or we have interests in maintaining our majority and power. And that is something that absolutely conflicts with the status quo, with the sort of leftist zeitgeist we see everywhere.
So we have
What I'm
another.
saying is, I hope we can do it. I don't know, what we're heading towards a cataclysm, I think, because the tensions are going to be so great. They're already so great. I mean, we see, Black Lives Matter and just an incredible focus on identity politics in universities. Students come out of universities now and they're totally into some kind of identity thing. And these identities clash. And the only identity that is off the table is white identity. They can't last. It cannot last. As we become a minority, we're going to we're going to be ascendant, and I think we already are.
Yeah. Would you say this is vindication of your work? Because after reading it, and this is from 1998, it seems to be coming true in a big way in the last few years.
Yeah, if you look at the last chapter of Culture of Critique, I said, that I predicted a world that was going to be increasingly divided, where there's going to be increasing social pressure for social controls on the white majority, on everybody, and we see that now. European societies I think are more advanced in some ways, and they're becoming police states. Where free speech is a thing of the past, and people are getting locked up or questioned by the police or fined for criticizing immigration. That's the kind of thing. And anytime there's like a celebration, like New Year's Eve or something, you can't do it without massive police presence. And that's true in this country. It's true throughout the West, wherever you've had mass immigration. And the problem, to a great extent, is that so many of these people, and the previous guy was pointing this out, that you have millions and millions of people that really can't make it in our society. If you think of the black IQ, the average IQ is 85. Well, that means millions of black people have IQs of 75, 80, 85. These people really can't function in our society. And their jobs are going to be replaced by robots, and it's just, they can't adjust to it. And so the tensions are going to increase in the future, because especially in the black community, I think, because there's a real strong sense of dysgenics there. There's a strong tendency towards dysgenics, where the people who are having the babies are the low-end ones, the ones who are on welfare and not doing well. Middle-class blacks are not, reproducing particularly. So, especially educated black women. I just see, I'm not optimistic about the future. I see cataclysms in the future. I may be wrong, but that's the thing. These leftists sign on to this belief, this utopian ideology. It's all going to work out. It's kumbaya. Things are just going to be just fine as soon as we get rid of white racism. It is completely false. It's ridiculous. I mean, it shows no understanding of history, where history is all about groups displacing each other. They act as if the only groups that have ever displaced anybody are whites, going to North America or something. That's just ridiculous. I mean, human groups have been displacing each other on every continent for eons. And it's not going to change. When the whites become a minority, it's very dangerous for whites, because we're going to be a hated minority, and we're going to have much less political power. So I'll probably be gone by then. So, but whatever. It's not something. It is something that I predicted in cultural critique.
So we have another written in question after that kind of heavy topic. This one's much lighter, actually. And I think the only one of its kind we'll get. So the question goes, I really enjoyed reading your studies on the behavioral development of wolves,
Really?
induction of normal prepubertal behavior in wolves with restricting rearing, and stability of individual differences in behavior in a litter of wolf cubs. What was it like to work with such amazing creatures? Did anything surprise you about the wolves that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I mean, it was something. You know, there was a wolf pack in University of Connecticut, and I had the privilege to work with them and took them out and you know, did these things. Um, what the main thing about the thing on restricted rearing is how normal these animals were, despite not really having a normal rearing environment. I mean, in other words, the message was that this was pretty genetically wired. And with personality traits, again, over long periods of time, they retain the same rank order and dominance and shyness and so on. And so it was a pretty interesting study. And I think you can certainly see elements of that in human studies, especially with personality. I mean, human personality is pretty stable. We may want to change our own personality, and sometimes I wanted to do that, but it's not easy to do.
And also, that question was from the Big KK. He's a big fan of wolves.
Okay.
Yeah. Next question is from Princess Twitch. Let me unmute the user 1 second. Okay. Go ahead.
Just came
Twitch.
on. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So at the moment, I want to pull it up to ask it word for word. First, thank you, Dr. MacDonald, for being here.
Yeah.
Second, all this commentary on a large people that is very much an in-depth commentary sort of does demand that I ask the relation sort of as it exists personally, obviously within the realm of propriety. So in essence, my question is, have you ever been, or are you presently, would you count yourself friends with any people who are Jewish? And if so, in what capacity are they Jewish? Only ethnically, religiously? And if that, like, are they Orthodox, Reformed, like something of their theological bent?
That's interesting. I had Jewish friends back in the 80s, and then when I started writing about Jews, it sort of became, I sensed, because this was sort of on my end before they even knew what I was doing. I felt a little estranged from that, but I kept going sort of superficially, and then after it blew up, there was nothing. But just lately, there are people that I've got a writer, Accidental Observer, Marcus, his first name, and he's a professor actually, and he writes essays for us. And I'm not a personal friend; I don't know him. And then there are a couple other Jewish guys who have corresponded with me on email and contributed. One of them contributed an article or two to Accidental Observer. And they're on page. They get the idea that white people are being dispossessed. They understand it, and they understand the role of Jews. One of these two guys, besides the professor, one of these two guys, they're both young guys. They're both in college. One is Orthodox, incredibly Orthodox. I mean, he wanted to go to the NPI conference in Washington, but he wanted to make sure the hotel was within walking distance of the venue because he's that Orthodox on Saturday, the other guy is much more, I'd say, he's strongly ethnically identified, but I don't think he's religious or very religious. But these guys are on page with white identity, and so I am open to that. I have no problem with that. As long as they're on board with our goals, and as long as they acknowledge what the role of the Jewish community in dispossessing us, I see no problem with that. I mean, I want to take all the allies we can get, and so that's what I've done.
Thank you.
I guess I have a question related to Hart-Celler, because that was done through legislation. Do you see legislation reversing itself, like ending birthright citizenship or changes in immigration in the reverse?
Boy, I don't know. I mean, I guess Donald Trump just talked about comprehensive immigration reform, where you have a drastic reduction of legal immigration. Boy, that is going to set off. Oh, that is going to be fought tooth and nail by the left, because that's their bread and butter. They're importing Democrats, they're importing non-whites, and they get it. It's going to be furious. I don't think anything like that can pass now. I would hope so. You got control of both houses of Congress. You got Trump in the White House, and that's something that is such a non-brainer, just a no-brainer to reduce legal immigration at a time when we don't need labor, we don't need anybody. And if we need labor, we should have contracts. They should go back to where they came from after their contract is up. There's no need to make them citizens. This whole thing since 1965 has been an attempt to change the demographics of the country. And I think, though, that I don't think it's possible to pass it now. I would hope that, and I'm glad that Trump is floating this now. But the whole assault on Trump, the Russia collusion thing and all that, I mean, Trump is sort of dead in the water in terms of legislative power right now. That is part of the design. I think that that the left minimally wants to sort of make his administration just get bogged down, or they can't do anything. And to some extent, they're succeeding in that.
All right, Ingela.
I don't have a question. I was linking you to people's questions, but Ice and Rock, you get to ask a question now, so I'll try and find you in the list.
Well, here, I'll ask a question now. This was
Okay.
a question asked by a user named Pat. His question was, what do you think of Mark Collette's book? Do you see the moral framework as elaborating on the group evolutionary strategies you said Occidentals could embrace? You hinted at this in the last chapter of Culture of Critique.
I confess I haven't read that book. I think I follow him on Twitter, and I've retweeted a bunch of his stuff. But I'm sorry, I can't. I'm really not familiar with that.
All right,
Okay.
Do we have Ice ready?
Yeah, this is a question from Of Ice and Rock. What do you think of Kurt Doolittle and proprietarianism, which is largely seen as an answer to particularism versus universalism?
What was that first word?
Particularism, but he's talking about proprietarianism, which is like a new economic.
Profiteering. Once again, you got me on that one. I really don't know.
Okay.
Anything about
That's fine.
Okay, we'll move to Kestrel. Let me unmute Kestrel and ask his question on American identity.
Yeah, hi, Dr. MacDonald. Thanks for coming
Hi.
on. So I live in the state of California, which receives a lot of. It's probably one of the highest immigration states at the moment.
Yeah, I was there for 30 years.
Yeah. So I'm involved. I'm a little bit of an activist in stuff like sort of like state secession movements. So this is why I'm kind of interested in this in the concept of something called intentional communities. Are you familiar with the term?
I've read something about secessionism and so on. Well, what do you mean exactly by intentional community?
So like an intentional community would be like a group of people with a similar ideology get together for the purpose of trying to create a center for that identity, so to speak.
Okay, yeah.
So I guess my question is there a case to be made for an American ethnicity? And how would that tie into a possible resettlement of white Americans to create a kind of intentional community somewhere in the United States or North America?
Well, I don't think there is any such thing as American ethnicity. There's white ethnicity, and that is what we're trying to do, I guess, on the alt-right. Is to develop a intentional community of people who identify as white and want to pursue interests as white people. So, yeah.
As so, like I've heard of sort of an argument for like epigenetics of Americans, as in like when Americans colonized or when colonialists colonized America, this sort of ideology kind of took hold in a lot of people's brains. Maybe a mentality of like expansionism. So I guess it's like an epigenetics thing, possibly. Have you heard of any theories based around this at all?
No, I mean, I think one of the really contentious things is what were the sources of American identity historically? Because what's happened is that the left has projected this sort of, we're nothing but a proposition nation. We always were a proposition nation back into American history. And I think that's false. I think that we had a sense of being a white nation until very recently. And even when, we certainly had the idea of Enlightenment ideals, but we did that within the sense that we were going to bias our immigration policy towards Northwestern Europe. And so we had a sense that this was a white European civilization. The problem, of course, with having a white American ethnicity is because you always had a large percentage, 10% or so of, or a little more of black people, African Americans. So that, those were very different ethnic groups, very different. So to me, you can never talk about an American ethnicity. I think whenever people talked about manifest destiny, they had a sense that they were white people, and they were conquering the continent and so on. They did not think of blacks as part of America, really, at that point. I'm not saying that should be the case. I'm just saying that that's the way it was.
Okay. I will be posing the next question, and this question comes from my father. He wanted to know your take on Martin Luther's approach regarding the Jewish community, and particularly his change in stance towards them, going from, in a way, looking forward to converting them to total denunciation.
Yeah, we've had some recent article or two. Andrew Joyce, I believe, wrote an article on Martin Luther, pointing that out. That at first Luther had the idea, the sort of naive idea, that he could convert Jews and they would be just wonderful Christians and so on. And then when he realized that that was not the case, he became hostile towards Jews. And but there were other issues at the time besides theology. The Jewish economic position in Europe, and the sort of traditional Jewish economic position in Europe, was exploitative quite often. And it did involve money lending and other professions that were seen as oppressive. So that fed into this ultimately. And that was certainly true in Germany. There's a strong sort of folk sense of anti-Semitism in European countries because they've lived through this. And you still see that in Eastern Europe because they've lived through it more recently. And so I think that those attitudes are still just below the surface, if not very explicit, because for one thing, there was a high profile of Jews in the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. So as usual, whenever there's strong anti-Semitism, it's a complicated story. And usually it involves much more than theology. It involves economic relationships.
Of course, thank you very much. It was very satisfactory. Next question.
InfoCat, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
To a certain extent, the Jewish community has fallen victim to their own ideology, at least the kind of temperamental changes they have elucidated over the last decades. they have pushed the egalitarianism to such an extent in the American media that I think many Jews have started to believe the myth themselves. The intermarriage rates by now in America alone are already above 70% for secular Jews.
Yeah.
They do marry quite a lot of goyim by now. They have less children, below replacement rate on average, because they are still secular, far less than the Orthodox community. But among the highly intelligent, high IQ intellectual Jews that occupy the upper echelon in American society, quite a lot of them, more than 70%, marry goyim. What do you think this will have as an influence on the Jewish community as an influence on the wider white community in America? So.
Yeah, that's a good question. And certainly it is the case in the West, and in the diaspora in the West, you see high rates of intermarriage. Now, that's not the case, of course, with the Orthodox Jewish communities in the West. And in a sense, these Orthodox Jewish communities are the sort of demographic engine of the Jewish population in the West. And I think that'll continue. I don't think Jews are going to danger being wiped out, but there is increasing numbers of intermarried, so they have children. Some of them, a lot of them, most of them probably identify as Jews, but they're mixed, you know, and they may not be as identified with the Jewish community as their parents or their grandparents were on the Jewish side. So it is a problem. And you got to realize, though, that Israel is not doing that. And it's interesting that, historically, that Zionism was intended to prevent any kind of intermarriage or assimilation. They could see that happening in Germany in the early 20th century. And they were very concerned about it. And Zionism was a solution. And that is certainly the case. In Israel, Jews marry other Jews, and if you can't prove your Jewish background, you probably can't even get married. So it's not as if Judaism is being endangered here, but in the West it is. And in terms of the sort of reform liberal type Jews are the ones who are doing this. But again, I don't think it's endangering the actual numbers of the Jewish community, because the Orthodox are having plenty of children. And they're intelligent a lot, and every generation there's a certain percentage of the Orthodox that peel off into the non-Orthodox. They become more secular, and so I think that is a phenomenon where they retain a lot of their ethnocentrism and so on. In any case, I don't see the actual leadership of the Jewish community falling into the hands of people who are not very Jewish ethnically. All the Jewish organizations I'm familiar with are headed by and staffed by and so strongly identified ethnic Jews, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
All right.
There was another part of this question that I wanted to ask as well.
Okay, go ahead.
The Orthodox do have far more children, significantly more. They may live in major metropolitan areas like the New York metropolitan area, but they slowly but surely colonize the more countryside areas, for example, in upstate New York.
Yeah.
Do you envisage them slowly but surely growing demographically in the future, just like they grew successfully in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe? There was a population explosion in the 19th century, especially, where they grew in a very short period of time by more than 1,000%, reaching up to 6 million individuals.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is one of the most important facts about Jewish history is the population explosion in Eastern Europe, because it produced incredible tensions where you had a lot of poor Jews and they overshot their economic niche. They were extremely unhappy. They became Zionists, or they became socialist, radicals, communist types. It was incredibly unsettling, and we're still feeling the effects of all that very much. These Orthodox communities, as you say, there are some in upstate New York. I was just reading about some of them, and they're creating tensions in those communities, because as soon as they can dominate the school board or the political system, they start doing things that are not appreciated by the rest of the people, and so they're producing a lot of tensions there. But they're branching out, yeah, and they're prolific, and that's the thing. I mean, these traditional religions were all highly, they're very, very pro-natalist, and you certainly see that in the Jewish community, and that's not going to stop, and they may do that. It's a very important aspect of Jewish history that you had. In fact, I don't think any of this. I don't think we'd be talking about Jews now if there hadn't been that population explosion. If the actual numbers of Jews in the West had remained about the same, we had a small Jewish community in New York and so on. I just don't think the tensions would have developed the way they did in this country or anywhere else.
All right, Hans, go ahead.
So my question was, why do you believe Ashkenazi Jews have a higher IQ than their Mizrahi and Sephardic counterparts? And do you believe it's due to their European genetics or their banishment from the common markets and jobs forcing them into like skilled positions where through successive generations they may, become?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Recent population genetic research seem to be aware of it, has shown substantial intermixture over the ages, and in fact may have started out with mainly European women with Jewish men, which is happening elsewhere in the world. And so there's this substantial introgression of European genes in the Jewish community. And that could contribute to the difference in IQ between those groups. The thing about the Sephardic Jews, though, historically, you had this very elite group of Sephardic Jews in Spain. They were not at all low IQ. They were very, very tough competitors. They're married into the elites, the Spanish elites. They retained their sense of ethnicity and so on, even after the Inquisition. But the Inquisition gradually wore them down, and basically it was the lower class Sephardic Jews that emigrated out of Spain to the Turkey and so on, and North Africa. And they were not particularly talented group by any means. So they were not high IQ kind of group. But and the other thing has been selection within the Jewish community. In chapter 7 of my first book on Jews, I talk about these very emphasis on scholars being able to have economic benefits. So if you were intelligent and be able to master the Talmud and so on, that kind of thing, you would have a great options in life. You have great marriage, economic opportunities, and you would have more children. And so this was producing a positive selection for IQ within the Jewish community for really, I think, really since Roman times. It was going on, because if you read the Talmud and the sections, the Jewish writing on that in the ancient world, they were very conscious of the importance of genetics, really, of good marriages, and they did not emphasize physical appearance; they emphasized intellectual ability. So that goes way back, and it certainly continued into early modern times in Europe.
And you want to do your other question? Okay, go ahead.
And then my second question was, as someone in the CSU system, you may know your way around it. I'm living in Huntington right now, and I was wondering, how do I find other identitarians and meet with them while still being under the CSU guidelines?
CSU?
Yeah, any Cal State University.
Oh, are you a student?
Yes.
Oh. Well, you probably have to be pretty secretive about it. I don't, it's very dangerous to come out that way. But, you could try to affiliate with the American Freedom Party, which is basically based in Southern California. And then there are people in Orange County. If you send me an email, the American Freedom Party has a website, and they would love to hear from you. But I could probably set you up with Bill Johnson, kind of thing.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next question will be coming from Moonman. Moonman, you're muted. Go ahead.
The question basically is, do you think that with the rise of the internet and television losing influence, will this result in a loss in Jewish power?
That's interesting. Certainly, social media has been a godsend to the alt-right and other dissidents. Hollywood, though, is adjusting to this new, they've always had to adjust. And I think that you look at something like Netflix, my understanding is that Netflix is not a Jewish company, but, they are trying to create a lot of original content. And when they create original content, they go to Hollywood. And that's still dominated by Jewish producers and Jewish writers and so on. So I don't see that necessarily, the fact that in the future probably will more and more content will be streamed rather than on cable or something or whatever. I don't think that's going to hurt Jewish power. You're still going to have media, and you're still going to have movies that are best seen in the theater, like these blockbuster or special effects movies where that kind of thing. So I don't see that changing necessarily. It's possible, but I don't see that happening.
All right. The next question is from.
I'm going to have to leave fairly soon because I got.
Okay. Yeah. Also, before you leave, could we, without being too presumptuous, ask if we could get Andrew Joyce on, or pass along?
I could put him in touch with you, certainly.
Okay.
And he'd be a great person to have on. And I must say, I'm very impressed with the quality of the questions and everything. I'd be happy to come on some other time.
I guess if we could get one last question before.
Yeah, let's do one more.
Is syntax? Syntax, your mic seems to still be muted.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Hello, Professor. Actually, it was very nice meeting you at the IHR meeting about 6 months ago.
Okay.
But so my question is, so there's many people who are ideologically opposed to EvoPsych, and most of them argue that it is really just a collection of just so stories. No matter how many pieces of novel conclusions reached from research into EvoPsych theories are presented, it seems that they will never be satisfied with the conclusions gained from this inconclusive field. So there's conclusions, but obviously there's a lot of non-conclusive studies that are done. So my question is, what is the best way that you have found to convince people that are ideologically against things like EvoPsych that there is merit in the field?
I think it's hard to convince anybody who's ideologically opposed to change their opinion.
Right.
You think about race differences or IQ or anything like that. I just don't see that happening. Evolutionary psychology has been dogged by that. It's just a bunch of just so stories throughout its entire history. But I think that, if you, especially now that we have, especially with neuropsychology, we can really understand, what's going on in the brain a lot better. And so, in other words, the proposals that evolutionary psychologists have made about what are the adaptations in the brain, they're certainly subjected to empirical studies, and increasingly they're able to pinpoint what part of the brain. I mean, my area really was personality psychology, and I regard, I had a theory where there were 5 main adaptations, 5 main systems that were differentiated in various ways. But there's all kinds of evidence for these systems being in the brain and very specific parts of the brain doing very specific function. Well, that's evolutionary psychology. And in my mind, that's absolutely nailed down. I don't see a problem with that. But that's in general how evolutionary psychology has to go. But there will always be problem. There will be complaints about it from people who don't like anything to do with evolution or genetics. They want to think that humans are absolutely, we're just blank slates and we're just written on by culture, and that's the end of the story. But it's always going to be with us. But in my opinion, there is overwhelming evidence for quite a few adaptations in the human brain, and for things like sex differences. I bought on one of the things that really converted me to evolutionary psychology early on in 1975 or whatever it was sex differences. When I saw the evolutionary theory of sex, everything just sort of popped into place, just by common sense understanding of male-female behavior, and then looking into historically males having harems and so on, and the sexual competition among males, and what happened after war, when with conquered peoples, and what happened to the women versus what happened to the men. This is evolutionary, and it has to do ultimately with evolutionary psychology. So to me, that I was converted at that point, and I've never strayed from that. And again, most of my research was in personality, but there's a lot of other very good stuff out there.
Right. Maybe just a follow-up one then. What do you think is the most? So maybe instead of trying to fight on ideological grounds, maybe what do you think? I mean, the sex differences are definitely very convincing, but maybe any specific studies or research that was, and I know they have like liar detection and a whole bunch of things, but that is really a kind of a nail in the coffin for the blank slatists, do you think?
Well, again, my area was personality psychology. I'm most familiar with that. I think that is, I don't think anybody could believe with blank slate and personality, because you got a behavior genetic studies showing heritabilities of 0.5 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so one recent study showing heritability is much higher than that, using different techniques. And so I think these things are nailed down. And if you look at recent textbooks in evolutionary psychology, I think you'll see a lot of examples. One of the things that's all struck me too, and this does relate to personality, but things like specific fears, like snake phobias and different things like that.
Right.
Those things are adaptations, and you don't see people going to psychiatrists or psychologists because they fear guns, unless they had a traumatic experience with it. But all kinds of people fear snakes, including me, with no bad experiences with snakes. These are things that are, to me, just overwhelming, knockout kind of arguments. And there's a lot more to that if you get into it. I've had to review that literature a few times, and it's overwhelming. There's a lot of great evolutionary psychology, and it's silly to think that we have to be on the defensive anymore.
That makes sense. So just overwhelm them with the good stuff, because there definitely is some inconclusive and bad studies.
There are things like that, and there's sometimes I look at a study and I say, well, are you kidding me? I don't really sign on to it.
But penis size and intelligence?
That kind of thing. Well,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Thank you for the answer.
As we wrap this up, one last thing. The guy who you said to send an email, what's the best email to send?
Well, probably Kevin MacDonald, kevin.macdonald@csulb.edu address, which is public.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So again, thank you.
It's my name with the dot in the middle, csulb.edu.
And we'd love to have you back. And I think everyone enjoyed it. So thank you again.
Well, I enjoyed it. I really did. Again, I'm very impressed by the questions and everything. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And for everyone else who's here, there's some big boys in the chat that we'd like to talk to too. We'll just pull you into staff. But in general, we're like, you can jump into the bottom channels and then talk amongst yourselves. And we'd like to pull some other people in just to talk. But yeah, jump in the bottom channels if you want to stay and chat.